Major Trevor Washington had just received the highest commendation of his 15-year military career when Colonel Marcus Hartwell called him into his office at Fort Carson, Colorado. What started as what Washington believed would be a congratulatory meeting quickly turned into a career-ending nightmare when Hartwell, without explanation or proper documentation, stripped Washington of his rank and reassigned him to administrative duties. Within hours of this unprecedented action, a phone call would reach the Pentagon that would trigger the most explosive military investigation of the decade, exposing a web of corruption, racial bias, and cover-ups that reached the highest levels of command. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The fluorescent lights in Building 1217 at Fort Carson cast their familiar harsh glow across the polished linoleum floors as Major Trevor Washington made his way through the corridor he had walked thousands of times before. It was 0800 hours on a Tuesday morning in September, and Washington carried himself with the confident bearing that had defined his military career since he first enlisted at 18. At 33, he was one of the youngest African-American majors in his division, a distinction he had earned through unwavering dedication, tactical brilliance, and an impeccable service record that included 2 tours in Afghanistan and 3 commendations for exceptional leadership. Washington had grown up in Detroit, the son of a factory worker and a schoolteacher who had instilled in him the values of hard work and integrity that would guide him through every challenge the military had thrown his way. His rise through the ranks had been meteoric by military standards, but it had come at a cost. He had missed his daughter's first steps while deployed overseas, had spent countless holidays away from his wife Sarah and their 2 children, and had sacrificed personal relationships in service to his country. But every sacrifice had felt worthwhile as he climbed the ladder of military hierarchy, earning respect from subordinates and superiors alike. The previous week had marked a pinnacle in Washington's career. He had been awarded the Legion of Merit for his exceptional performance in leading a complex joint training operation that had been hailed as a model for future military exercises. The ceremony had been attended by high-ranking officials from multiple branches of the military, and Washington's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Brennan, had personally commended his strategic thinking and leadership capabilities. The local military newspaper had featured a front-page article about Washington's achievement, highlighting his innovative approach to tactical planning and his ability to unite diverse units under a common mission. Colonel Marcus Hartwell was a different breed of military officer. A 28-year veteran with deep Texas roots and old-school military sensibilities, Hartwell had taken command of the base just 6 months earlier, transferring from Fort Hood amid what military gossip suggested were disciplinary issues that had been quietly swept under the rug. Hartwell was known for his rigid adherence to traditional military hierarchy and his belief that changes to military culture were happening too quickly. He had made several controversial decisions since taking command, including reversing diversity initiatives that previous commanders had implemented and reassigning several minority officers to what many considered less prestigious positions. The tension between Washington and Hartwell had been building subtly over the months since Hartwell's arrival. It began with small disagreements during staff meetings, where Hartwell would dismiss Washington's suggestions without consideration or interrupt him mid-sentence to redirect conversations. Washington had noticed that Hartwell seemed to scrutinize his work more closely than that of other officers of similar rank, questioning decisions that had previously been routine and requiring additional documentation for actions that other majors could authorize independently. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a civilian contractor working on base as a military psychologist, had observed these interactions during joint meetings and had grown increasingly concerned about what she perceived as a pattern of discriminatory behavior. Rodriguez had worked with military personnel for over a decade and had developed a keen eye for the subtle dynamics that could indicate bias in military leadership. She had begun documenting instances where she witnessed unequal treatment, not out of any desire to cause trouble, but from a professional obligation to ensure that all military personnel were treated fairly, regardless of their background. The meeting that would change everything was scheduled for 08:30 hours on that September morning. Washington had received a brief email the previous afternoon requesting his presence in Hartwell's office with no indication of the meeting's purpose or agenda. Given the recent recognition he had received, Washington assumed it might be a discussion about future assignments or additional responsibilities that often came with career advancement. He had prepared a brief summary of his current projects and had even brought along a proposal for improving training efficiency that he had been developing in his spare time. Hartwell's office reflected his personality and background. The walls were lined with military memorabilia from his years of service, including photographs with various high-ranking officials and certificates of achievement that documented his steady but unremarkable climb through the ranks. A large American flag stood in the corner, and his desk was organized with military precision. Behind his chair hung a portrait of a previous base commander whom Hartwell had served under early in his career, a man known for his conservative views on military tradition and resistance to what he called progressive changes in military culture. When Washington knocked and entered the office, Hartwell was seated behind his desk, reviewing a file that he quickly closed as Washington approached. The colonel's expression was stern, lacking the professional courtesy that typically characterized interactions between officers of their respective ranks. Hartwell gestured for Washington to take a seat in one of the two chairs positioned in front of his desk, but remained seated himself, a breach of protocol that immediately set an uncomfortable tone for the meeting. What followed was a conversation that would later be scrutinized by military investigators, Pentagon officials, and congressional committees. Hartwell began by questioning Washington's recent performance, despite the major's recent commendation and spotless service record. He raised concerns about Washington's leadership style, claiming that several subordinates had complained about his methods, though he refused to provide specific examples or identify the complainants. Washington requested clarification and asked to see any formal complaints that had been filed, but Hartwell dismissed these requests, stating that he was not required to provide such documentation. The conversation took an increasingly hostile turn as Hartwell began questioning decisions Washington had made months earlier, decisions that had been approved by previous commanders and had resulted in successful outcomes. Hartwell suggested that Washington's approach to leadership was incompatible with traditional military values and implied that his rapid advancement had been the result of affirmative action policies rather than merit. These accusations caught Washington completely off guard, as his entire career had been built on measurable achievements and documented successes. Sergeant First Class David Chen, who worked in the administrative offices adjacent to Hartwell's office, would later testify that he could hear raised voices coming from the colonel's office, though he could not make out specific words. Chen had worked in military administration for 12 years and had never heard such heated exchanges between officers of such high rank. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, far longer than typical meetings of this nature, and Chen noticed that other staff members in the area had become aware of the unusual situation.
As the meeting reached its climax, Hartwell made a decision that would reverberate through military command structures across the country. Without following proper channels, without consulting with higher command, and without providing the due process required by military regulations, he informed Washington that he was being demoted to the rank of captain and reassigned to administrative duties effective immediately. The shock of this announcement left Washington momentarily speechless, as such drastic disciplinary action typically required extensive documentation, multiple levels of approval, and formal hearings where the accused officer could present a defense.
Washington's military training kicked in despite his shock, and he requested to know the specific charges that warranted such severe punishment. Hartwell's response was vague and inconsistent, citing undefined performance issues and unspecified complaints from personnel under Washington's command. When Washington asked about the appeals process and his right to legal representation, Hartwell curtly informed him that the decision was final and that any attempt to challenge it would be considered insubordination. The immediate aftermath of this meeting would set in motion a series of events that neither officer could have anticipated. Washington left Hartwell's office in a state of professional devastation, his 15-year career seemingly destroyed in a single conversation. But what Hartwell failed to realize was that Washington's reputation extended far beyond Fort Carson, and that his sudden demotion would raise immediate red flags among colleagues who knew his exemplary service record and professional capabilities. The news of Washington's demotion spread through Fort Carson's military community with the velocity of classified intelligence. Within 2 hours of his meeting with Hartwell, whispers echoed through barracks, mess halls, and administrative buildings as personnel struggled to comprehend how one of their most decorated officers could fall so dramatically overnight. Staff Sergeant Monica Rivers, who had served under Washington's command for 3 years, was conducting routine equipment inventory when she received word through unofficial channels. Rivers had witnessed Washington's leadership firsthand during critical training exercises and had personally credited him with advancing her own military career through his mentorship and fair treatment of all personnel, regardless of background. Captain Michael Torres, Washington's longtime colleague and friend, was reviewing tactical reports in his office when Lieutenant Colonel Brennan appeared at his door with an expression of disbelief and barely contained anger. Torres had served alongside Washington through 2 deployment cycles and had never encountered an officer with higher integrity or more consistent performance. Brennan's revelation about Washington's sudden demotion struck Torres as not just professionally devastating, but fundamentally wrong, violating every principle of military justice and proper command structure he had learned throughout his career. The ripple effects extended beyond Fort Carson's boundaries almost immediately. Colonel Patricia Stone, stationed at the Pentagon and responsible for monitoring personnel changes across major military installations, received the routine notification of Washington's rank change during her afternoon briefing session. Stone's computer system flagged the demotion as unusual due to the absence of accompanying disciplinary documentation, formal charges, or the standard appeals process timeline. Having overseen thousands of personnel actions throughout her career, Stone recognized that such abrupt rank reductions typically involved court-martial proceedings, extensive investigation records, or emergency situations requiring immediate intervention. Stone's initial inquiry to Fort Carson's personnel office yielded responses that only deepened her concerns. The administrative staff could provide no formal documentation supporting Washington's demotion, no records of disciplinary hearings, and no evidence of the due process required by military regulations for such severe punishment. Master Sergeant Robert Kim, who managed personnel records at Fort Carson, admitted privately to Stone that he had never processed a rank reduction with so little supporting documentation in his 18 years of military service. Dr. Rodriguez, who had been documenting concerning patterns in Hartwell's behavior, received notification of Washington's demotion through official channels later that afternoon. Her professional training in organizational psychology immediately raised red flags about the rapid escalation from subtle discriminatory behavior to such drastic punitive action. Rodriguez had completed extensive research on bias in military leadership and recognized that Washington's case exhibited classic characteristics of discriminatory targeting, particularly the lack of documented performance issues preceding such severe discipline.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The evening following Washington's demotion brought unexpected developments that would prove crucial to subsequent investigations. Technical Sergeant Lisa Park, responsible for digital communications security at Fort Carson, was conducting routine system maintenance when she discovered irregularities in email and communication records related to Washington's case. Park security clearance allowed her access to administrative communications, and she noticed that several emails between Hartwell and external contacts had been mysteriously deleted from the system, leaving only partial timestamps and metadata traces. Washington himself spent that evening in his modest base housing, attempting to explain to his wife Sarah and their children why their lives were about to change dramatically. Sarah, a registered nurse who had supported her husband's military career through multiple deployments and countless challenges, struggled to understand how someone with Washington's exemplary record could face such sudden professional destruction. Their daughter, Emma, a high school senior who had planned to attend military academy following her father's example, sat in stunned silence as her family's stability crumbled around them. The next morning brought developments that would transform Washington's personal crisis into a military-wide investigation. General Patricia Martinez, a three-star general known for her unwavering commitment to military justice and equal treatment, received a detailed briefing about Washington's case during her daily Pentagon security meeting. Martinez had built her career on addressing systemic issues within military command structures and had previously led investigations that resulted in significant reforms to military personnel policies. Martinez's review of Washington's service record revealed achievements that made his sudden demotion even more suspicious. His tactical innovations had been studied and implemented across multiple military installations. His leadership training programs had been adopted as standard curriculum at officer training schools, and his performance evaluations consistently ranked in the top 5% of officers at his level. The stark contrast between Washington's documented excellence and Hartwell's claims of performance deficiencies suggested either a dramatic and unexplained decline in capabilities or potential misconduct by command authority. The investigation machinery began moving with bureaucratic efficiency that belied the explosive nature of the case. Martinez personally contacted Admiral James Sullivan, who oversaw military personnel integrity investigations, requesting immediate deployment of investigative resources to Fort Carson. Sullivan had handled sensitive cases involving command misconduct throughout his career, but the combination of racial implications, command abuse, and potential cover-up activities made Washington's case particularly volatile from both military and public relations perspectives. Investigator Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Brooks, a former military attorney with extensive experience in command misconduct cases, received an assignment to lead the Fort Carson investigation. Brooks had developed a reputation for meticulous attention to detail and unwavering commitment to military justice, regardless of the political implications or career consequences for high-ranking officers. His previous investigations had resulted in court-martial proceedings for 2 colonels and 1 brigadier general, demonstrating his willingness to pursue misconduct cases to their logical conclusions. Brooks arrived at Fort Carson accompanied by a team of specialists, including forensic accountants, digital communications experts, and personnel psychologists trained in detecting patterns of discriminatory behavior. Their preliminary review of Washington's case file immediately revealed procedural violations that would have prevented the demotion from being legally enforceable under normal circumstances. The absence of formal charges, documented performance issues, or appeals process compliance suggested either gross incompetence or deliberate misconduct by command authority. The investigation team's interview process began with personnel who had worked closely with both Washington and Hartwell. Staff Sergeant Rivers provided detailed testimony about Washington's leadership capabilities, citing specific instances where his decision-making had prevented equipment failures, improved training outcomes, and enhanced unit cohesion. Her account directly contradicted Hartwell's claims about subordinate complaints, as Rivers had never witnessed any personnel expressing dissatisfaction with Washington's command style or professional capabilities. Captain Torres offered crucial insights into the timeline of tensions between Washington and Hartwell, documenting instances of unequal treatment that had escalated over the months preceding the demotion. Torres had maintained detailed personal notes about staff meetings where he witnessed Hartwell interrupting Washington, dismissing his suggestions without consideration, and requiring additional documentation for routine decisions that other officers could authorize independently. These observations provided investigators with evidence of discrimination that preceded the dramatic disciplinary action. Dr. Rodriguez's documentation proved invaluable to the investigation team's understanding of systemic issues under Hartwell's command. Her professional observations, recorded contemporaneously with the incidents she witnessed, provided objective analysis of behavioral patterns that suggested bias-motivated decision-making. Rodriguez's psychological training enabled her to identify subtle forms of discrimination that might escape notice from personnel without specialized background in organizational behavior and bias recognition. The technical investigation yielded disturbing discoveries about digital communications surrounding Washington's case. Technical Sergeant Park's security analysis revealed that multiple emails between Hartwell and external contacts had been systematically deleted using administrative privileges, suggesting potential coordination with individuals outside Fort Carson's command structure. The timing of these deletions, occurring in the hours immediately after Washington's demotion, indicated possible efforts to conceal evidence of improper coordination or influence. Forensic recovery of deleted communications uncovered partial evidence of correspondence between Hartwell and individuals whose identities remained encrypted, but whose communication patterns suggested coordination with other military installations facing similar personnel challenges. The fragmented nature of recovered data prevented immediate identification of co-conspirators, but provided sufficient evidence to expand the investigation beyond Fort Carson's boundaries and examine whether Washington's case represented isolated misconduct or part of broader systematic issues. As the investigation progressed into its second week, additional evidence emerged that transformed the scope and urgency of the case. Military personnel from other installations began providing information about similar incidents involving minority officers facing unexplained disciplinary action, suggesting that Washington's case might represent one component of a larger pattern of discriminatory targeting across multiple military facilities. 3 weeks into the investigation, Lieutenant Colonel Brooks received a confidential communication that would shatter any remaining assumptions about the isolated nature of Washington's case. Master Sergeant Angela Foster, stationed at Fort Bragg in North Carolina, had contacted military investigators through secure channels after learning about the Pentagon's inquiry into discriminatory practices. Foster brought with her a meticulously maintained collection of documents, photographs, and audio recordings that painted a disturbing picture of coordinated efforts to undermine minority officers across multiple military installations throughout the southeastern United States.
Foster's evidence revealed a sophisticated network of communication between certain commanding officers who had been systematically targeting high-performing minority personnel through manufactured performance reviews, fabricated disciplinary charges, and coordinated character assassination campaigns. Her documentation included encrypted email chains, meeting schedules that coincided with discriminatory actions at different bases, and financial records showing unusual travel patterns among officers later identified as participants in what investigators would term Operation Whitewash. The scope of Foster's revelations demanded immediate expansion of the investigative team and coordination with federal law enforcement agencies. FBI Special Agent Jennifer Hayes, specializing in civil rights violations and conspiracy cases, joined the investigation after reviewing preliminary evidence suggesting federal crimes, including conspiracy to deprive individuals of civil rights, mail fraud, and obstruction of justice. Hayes brought expertise in complex multi-jurisdictional investigations and resources for analyzing financial transactions, digital communications, and coordinated criminal activities spanning multiple states. Colonel Hartwell's financial records, subpoenaed through federal court orders, revealed a pattern of unexplained deposits and expenditures that coincided with his discriminatory actions against Washington and other minority officers. Forensic accountant Margaret Chen discovered that Hartwell had received payments totaling over $50,000 from offshore accounts linked to private military contracting firms with documented histories of discriminatory hiring practices and political connections to organizations opposing military diversity initiatives. The investigation uncovered that Hartwell's transfer to Fort Carson had not been the routine reassignment initially documented in his personnel file. Instead, his previous commanding officer at Fort Hood, Colonel Richard Vance, had orchestrated the transfer after Hartwell faced internal complaints about discriminatory behavior that threatened to become public scandals. Vance had falsified transfer documentation to conceal the disciplinary nature of Hartwell's reassignment, allowing him to assume command at Fort Carson with unblemished records that concealed his history of bias-motivated misconduct. Digital forensics expert Captain Sarah Zhao made breakthrough discoveries while analyzing recovered communications from Hartwell's deleted files. Zhao uncovered evidence of a private forum hosted on encrypted servers where military officers shared strategies for targeting minority personnel, discussed methods for avoiding legal consequences, and coordinated timing of discriminatory actions to minimize investigative attention. The forum, operating under the code name Patriot Shield, included participants from 17 different military installations across 12 states. The Patriot Shield investigation revealed that Washington's demotion had been planned months in advance, coinciding with his receipt of the Legion of Merit Award that had elevated his profile within military leadership circles. Forum communications showed that Hartwell had specifically requested advice on neutralizing what participants termed high-visibility minority threats, who might inspire other minority officers or attract attention from Pentagon diversity initiatives. The calculated nature of these actions transformed the investigation from personnel misconduct to potential federal conspiracy charges. Testimony from additional witnesses began painting a comprehensive picture of systematic harassment that had preceded Washington's demotion by months. Lieutenant Jessica Barnes, who had worked closely with Washington on joint training exercises, described incidents where Hartwell had deliberately excluded Washington from critical planning meetings, reassigned his personnel without notification, and publicly questioned his decisions in front of subordinates. Barnes had documented these incidents in her personal journal, providing investigators with contemporaneous evidence of escalating discriminatory treatment. The investigation's expansion to other military installations yielded disturbing discoveries about the scope and sophistication of discriminatory networks operating within military command structures. At Fort Stewart in Georgia, investigators discovered that Colonel Thomas Wright had used identical tactics to those employed by Hartwell, including manufactured performance issues, unsubstantiated disciplinary charges, and coordinated character assassination campaigns, targeting minority officers who had achieved significant career advancement or public recognition. Major Nicole Jackson, an African-American officer stationed at Fort Stewart, provided testimony about her experiences under Wright's command that mirrored Washington's ordeal with frightening precision. Jackson had been stripped of her security clearance, reassigned to menial administrative duties, and subjected to intensive scrutiny of her personal finances and associations after receiving commendation for developing innovative logistical systems that had saved the military millions of dollars in operational costs. The similarities between Jackson's and Washington's cases provided investigators with clear evidence of coordinated discriminatory tactics. The criminal conspiracy investigation expanded when federal prosecutors discovered that several private military contractors had been paying officers to identify and target minority personnel who might compete for lucrative post-military consulting positions or threaten existing power structures within the military-industrial complex. Companies including Apex Defense Solutions and Strategic Military Consulting had channeled payments through shell corporations and offshore accounts to military officers willing to sabotage the careers of potential competitors. Congressional oversight committees, alerted to the investigation's findings by Pentagon whistleblowers, announced plans for public hearings that would expose the full scope of discriminatory networks operating within military command structures. Senator Elizabeth Crawford, chairwoman of the Armed Services Subcommittee on Personnel, issued statements indicating that the hearings would examine not only individual cases of discrimination, but also systemic failures in military oversight and accountability mechanisms that had allowed such networks to operate undetected. The political implications of the investigation reached the highest levels of military and civilian leadership when it was discovered that Congressman Bradley Mitchell, a member of the House Armed Services Committee, had received substantial campaign contributions from military contractors involved in the discriminatory network. Mitchell had consistently opposed military diversity initiatives, blocked funding for discrimination prevention programs, and used his congressional position to protect officers facing discrimination complaints from serious consequences. As federal prosecutors prepared criminal charges against participants in the discriminatory network, additional evidence emerged suggesting that the conspiracy extended beyond individual cases of career sabotage to include broader efforts to influence military policy, contractor selection processes, and leadership appointments. The investigation revealed that network participants had coordinated efforts to block minority officers from key assignments, prevent their advancement to positions of significant authority, and maintain what forum communications described as traditional military leadership structures. Dr. Rodriguez's analysis of psychological profiles from network participants revealed common characteristics including resistance to organizational change, adherence to traditional hierarchical structures, and belief systems that viewed diversity initiatives as threats to military effectiveness. Her professional assessment indicated that the discriminatory network represented not merely individual prejudices, but organized resistance to evolving military culture and demographics that threatened existing power structures. The investigation team's analysis of timing patterns revealed that discriminatory actions against minority officers had intensified following Pentagon announcements of expanded diversity initiatives, increased funding for minority recruitment programs, and high-profile appointments of minority officers to leadership positions. The correlation between policy announcements and discriminatory actions provided prosecutors with evidence of coordinated resistance to military diversity efforts at the highest levels of command.
Financial analysis of network participants revealed that discriminatory actions had generated substantial financial benefits through contractor relationships, consulting opportunities, and political contributions that rewarded officers for maintaining traditional military power structures. The intersection of financial incentives and discriminatory behavior provided prosecutors with clear motives for conspiracy charges and civil rights violations that could result in significant prison sentences for convicted participants. As the investigation approached its fourth week, the evidence collected by federal prosecutors, military investigators, and congressional oversight committees had exposed a criminal conspiracy involving dozens of military officers, private contractors, and political figures across multiple states. The scope and sophistication of the discriminatory network far exceeded initial expectations when Washington first challenged his unjust demotion, transforming a single personnel complaint into one of the most significant military corruption investigations in modern American history. The morning of October 15th brought developments that would forever alter the trajectory of military justice in America. Federal prosecutors unsealed indictments against 37 military officers, 12 private contractors,
and 5 political figures in what Attorney General Diana Reynolds described as the largest military corruption case in United States history. The coordinated arrests, conducted simultaneously across 14 states, shattered the discriminatory network that had operated with impunity for over a decade, while destroying the careers of hundreds of minority military personnel. Colonel Hartwell's arrest at Fort Carson occurred at 0600 hours, as he prepared for what he believed would be a routine morning briefing. FBI agents, accompanied by military police and federal marshals, executed search warrants for his office, personal quarters, and off-base residence, while reading federal charges including conspiracy to violate civil rights, mail fraud, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. The spectacle of a senior military officer being led away in handcuffs sent shockwaves through the base community and marked the beginning of the most dramatic day in Fort Carson's modern history. Simultaneously, federal agents raided the headquarters of Apex Defense Solutions in Arlington, Virginia, seizing servers, financial records, and communications equipment that contained evidence of the company's role in funding discriminatory activities across multiple military installations. Company CEO Marcus Thompson, a former brigadier general with extensive Pentagon connections, was arrested at his suburban mansion as investigators discovered evidence of Swiss bank accounts containing millions of dollars in payments to military officers willing to sabotage minority military careers. The scope of the morning's arrests extended to Capitol Hill, where Congressman Bradley Mitchell was taken into custody at his Washington office, as FBI agents executed search warrants for his campaign headquarters, personal residences, and financial records. Mitchell's arrest on charges of bribery, conspiracy, and using his congressional position to obstruct military diversity initiatives marked the first time in over 2 decades that a sitting member of Congress had been charged in connection with military corruption. At Fort Bragg, Colonel Thomas Wright attempted to flee federal custody by commandeering a military vehicle and leading law enforcement on a high-speed chase that ended when he crashed into a security barrier while trying to escape the base. Wright's desperate flight provided prosecutors with additional charges of evading arrest and destruction of government property, while his panicked behavior during arrest confirmed investigators' assessment that the discriminatory network had been preparing contingency plans for potential exposure. The Patriot Shield Forum, which had served as the digital headquarters for coordinating discriminatory activities, was simultaneously taken offline as federal cybercrime specialists executed court orders seizing servers located in offshore data centers. The forum's encrypted communications, now fully decoded by FBI technical specialists, revealed the shocking extent of coordination between network participants, including detailed plans for targeting specific minority officers, strategies for concealing discriminatory motives, and distribution of payments for successful career sabotage operations. Major Nicole Jackson, whose testimony had been crucial in exposing the network's operations at Fort Stewart, was present at the Pentagon when news of the arrests broke. Jackson had been working with federal prosecutors to prepare for upcoming trials while simultaneously receiving protection from potential retaliation by network participants who remained at large. Her emotional reaction to learning that her tormentors would finally face justice was captured by news cameras and became an iconic image representing the triumph of military personnel who had risked their careers to expose systematic discrimination. The international implications of the investigation became apparent when forensic accountants discovered that discriminatory network funding had originated from foreign sources seeking to undermine American military effectiveness through internal division and the elimination of talented minority military officers. Intelligence agencies identified payments from shell companies linked to adversarial nations that had been working to weaken American military capabilities by encouraging internal conflicts and preventing the military from fully utilizing its diverse human resources. Trevor Washington, whose unjust demotion had triggered the entire investigation, received notification of Hartwell's arrest while attending a legal strategy meeting with his military attorneys. The vindication of his complaints and the exposure of the conspiracy that had targeted him brought a mixture of relief and profound sadness about the careers destroyed by discriminatory networks. Washington's immediate reinstatement to his previous rank, along with back pay and formal apologies from Pentagon leadership, marked the beginning of justice for network victims. The arrest warrants revealed that the discriminatory network had maintained detailed target lists containing names, photographs, and strategic plans for sabotaging the careers of over 300 minority military officers across all branches of service. These lists, discovered during raids on network participants' properties, provided prosecutors with evidence of premeditated conspiracy that would support the most serious federal charges and lengthy prison sentences for convicted participants. Congressional hearings, accelerated following the dramatic arrests, began with explosive testimony from whistleblowers who detailed the network's infiltration of military promotion boards, assignment committees, and disciplinary review panels. Senator Elizabeth Crawford's opening statement declared that the hearings would examine not only criminal conspiracies, but also institutional failures that had enabled systematic discrimination to flourish within military command structures for over a decade. Pentagon leadership, scrambling to address the crisis of confidence created by the scandal, announced comprehensive reforms, including independent oversight of all personnel decisions involving minority officers, mandatory bias training for command personnel, and establishment of anonymous reporting systems for discrimination complaints. Defense Secretary Robert Kim promised that military culture would undergo fundamental transformation to prevent future discriminatory networks from operating within American armed forces. The private military contracting industry faced intense scrutiny as investigators revealed how companies had used discriminatory networks to maintain competitive advantages by eliminating minority military personnel who might later compete for lucrative consulting positions. Federal prosecutors announced plans to investigate dozens of additional contractors suspected of participating in or benefiting from discriminatory activities, while Congress threatened to revoke government contracts from companies involved in the conspiracy. Media coverage of the arrests dominated national news cycles as Americans struggled to comprehend the scope and sophistication of discriminatory networks operating within their military. Editorial boards across the country condemned the conspiracy while praising the courage of whistleblowers who had risked their careers to expose systematic injustice. The story resonated particularly strongly in minority communities, where military service had traditionally represented pathways to advancement and respect. International allies expressed concern about American military reliability in light of revelations that discriminatory networks had been undermining operational effectiveness by eliminating talented personnel based on racial characteristics rather than merit. NATO officials requested briefings about measures being implemented to ensure that American military leadership could be trusted to make decisions based on professional qualifications rather than discriminatory biases.
The psychological impact on military personnel who had served under network participants became apparent as counseling services reported dramatic increases in requests for support from officers questioning whether their own career challenges had resulted from discrimination rather than performance issues. Dr. Rodriguez, now serving as a consultant to Pentagon reform efforts, emphasized that rebuilding trust within military communities would require years of sustained effort and transparent accountability measures. Financial restitution for network victims emerged as a major challenge as prosecutors calculated that discriminatory actions had cost targeted officers millions of dollars in lost wages, benefits, and career advancement opportunities. Class action lawsuits against private contractors and government agencies promised to extend legal proceedings for years while providing compensation for personnel whose lives had been devastated by systematic discrimination. As federal prosecutors prepared for trials that would expose the full scope of the discriminatory conspiracy, additional evidence continued emerging about network connections to extremist organizations, foreign intelligence services, and political movements seeking to undermine American military effectiveness. The investigation had evolved from a single personnel complaint into a national security crisis that would reshape military culture and federal law enforcement approaches to institutional discrimination. 6 months after the mass arrests that dismantled the discriminatory network, federal courthouse steps in Alexandria, Virginia, became the epicenter of American military justice as the most significant war crimes tribunal in domestic history commenced. Judge Patricia Hernandez, appointed to oversee the consolidated trials due to her expertise in civil rights law and military justice, presided over proceedings that would determine the fate of 37 defendants whose conspiracy had undermined American military effectiveness for over a decade. The prosecution's opening statements, delivered by Assistant Attorney General Michael Chen, painted a comprehensive picture of betrayal that shocked even seasoned legal observers. Chen's presentation included audio recordings from Patriot Shield Forum meetings where defendants had celebrated successful career destructions, financial documents showing millions in payments for discriminatory actions, and victim impact statements from over 400 military personnel whose lives had been destroyed by systematic targeting based on racial characteristics rather than professional merit. Colonel Hartwell's defense strategy, orchestrated by prominent military attorney David Richardson, attempted to portray the conspiracy as misguided patriotism rather than criminal discrimination. Richardson argued that his client and co-defendants had genuinely believed that maintaining traditional military culture required resistance to what they perceived as politically motivated diversity initiatives that compromised operational effectiveness. This defense immediately backfired when prosecutors presented evidence showing that targeted minority officers had consistently outperformed their peers in measurable categories, including tactical innovation, leadership effectiveness, and operational success rates. The trial's first week featured devastating testimony from Master Sergeant Angela Foster, whose evidence had exposed the network's multi-state operations. Foster's detailed presentation of financial records, encrypted communications, and coordination timelines demolished defense claims that discriminatory actions had been isolated incidents rather than systematic conspiracy. Her testimony revealed that network participants had maintained spreadsheets tracking successful career destructions, with bonus payments awarded for eliminating minority officers who had achieved significant recognition or advancement. Dr. Elena Rodriguez took the witness stand during the trial's second week, providing expert psychological analysis of network communications that revealed sophisticated understanding of discriminatory tactics and deliberate strategies for avoiding legal consequences. Rodriguez's testimony demonstrated that defendants had studied civil rights law to identify methods for concealing discriminatory motives while achieving desired outcomes of eliminating minority personnel from positions of authority and influence. The courtroom atmosphere grew increasingly tense when prosecutors presented evidence of foreign intelligence connections that had funded network operations through offshore shell companies. FBI counterintelligence specialist agent Rebecca Walsh testified that intercepted communications showed adversarial nations had specifically targeted American military diversity initiatives, recognizing that eliminating talented minority officers would weaken overall military effectiveness while creating internal divisions that could be exploited during international crises. Trevor Washington's testimony marked the emotional climax of the prosecution's case as he described the personal devastation caused by his unjust demotion and the systematic campaign to destroy his military career. Washington's detailed account of Hartwell's discriminatory treatment, supported by contemporaneous documentation and witness testimony, provided jurors with a human face for the abstract legal concepts of conspiracy and civil rights violations. His description of explaining to his children why his father's distinguished military service had been criminally undermined brought several jurors to tears.
The defense's cross-examination of Washington backfired spectacularly when Hartwell's attorney attempted to suggest that affirmative action policies had been responsible for Washington's rapid advancement rather than merit-based achievement. Prosecutor Chen immediately presented Washington's performance evaluations, tactical innovations, and measurable contributions to military effectiveness, demonstrating that his success had resulted from exceptional professional capabilities rather than preferential treatment. The attorney's line of questioning reinforced prosecution's arguments about defendants' discriminatory motivations. Testimony from Major Jackson and other network victims created a powerful narrative about the scope and impact of systematic discrimination. Jackson's description of psychological harassment, professional sabotage, and financial devastation caused by discriminatory targeting provided jurors with a comprehensive understanding of how network operations had destroyed lives while undermining military effectiveness. Her account of attempted suicide following her security clearance revocation demonstrated the life-threatening consequences of defendants' criminal conspiracy. The prosecution's presentation of Patriot Shield forum communications proved devastating to defense arguments about innocent intentions or isolated misconduct. Audio recordings revealed defendants celebrating successful career destructions, sharing strategies for concealing discriminatory motives, and coordinating timing of attacks to maximize damage while minimizing investigative attention. Forum participants had used dehumanizing language to describe minority officers, referring to successful sabotage operations as pest control and discussing elimination strategies with callous disregard for human consequences. Corporate executives from Apex Defense Solutions and Strategic Military Consulting faced separate proceedings focusing on their company's roles in funding discriminatory networks and profiting from systematic elimination of minority military personnel. CEO Marcus Thompson's testimony, given in exchange for reduced sentencing, revealed that private contractors had viewed discriminatory networks as cost-effective methods for maintaining competitive advantages by preventing minority officers from later competing for lucrative consulting positions. Congressional testimony from Congressman Bradley Mitchell, who had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors after his arrest, exposed the political dimensions of the discriminatory conspiracy. Mitchell described how network participants had coordinated legislative efforts to block military diversity funding, prevent discrimination oversight initiatives, and protect officers facing discrimination complaints from serious consequences. His testimony revealed that political opposition to military diversity had been systematically coordinated with criminal efforts to eliminate minority personnel. The international security implications of the discriminatory network became clear through testimony from Pentagon intelligence officials who described how foreign adversaries had monitored network activities and adjusted their strategic planning based on knowledge that American military effectiveness was being deliberately undermined from within. Intelligence assessments indicated that adversarial nations had delayed aggressive actions in certain regions, while discriminatory networks weakened American military capabilities through systematic elimination of talented personnel. Defense arguments about patriotic motivations collapsed when prosecutors presented evidence showing that network participants had prioritized personal financial gain over military effectiveness or national security. Financial records revealed that defendants had received substantial payments for successful discriminatory actions, while their targets had consistently demonstrated superior professional performance and contributed more effectively to military missions than their persecutors. The trial's most dramatic moment occurred when federal prosecutors played audio recordings of Hartwell discussing plans to target Washington specifically because his high-profile achievements and public recognition threatened to inspire other minority officers and attract positive attention to military diversity initiatives. Hartwell's recorded voice expressing satisfaction about destroying Washington's career and speculating about the psychological impact on his family demonstrated the callous calculation behind his criminal actions. Victim impact statements, presented during the trial's fourth week, provided comprehensive documentation of lives destroyed by systematic discrimination. Families described financial devastation, psychological trauma, and loss of faith in American military institutions caused by network operations. Children of targeted officers testified about abandoning military career aspirations after witnessing their parents' destruction, while spouses described divorce, depression, and attempted suicide resulting from discriminatory persecution. Expert testimony from military historians and organizational psychologists demonstrated that discriminatory networks had caused measurable damage to American military effectiveness by eliminating talented personnel, creating climates of fear among minority officers, and undermining unit cohesion through systematic injustice. Academic research presented during the trial showed that military units with diverse leadership consistently outperformed homogeneous units in tactical exercises, strategic planning, and operational effectiveness measures. As the prosecution rested its case after 5 weeks of testimony, the evidence presented had comprehensively demonstrated that defendants' actions constituted not only criminal conspiracy and civil rights violations, but also deliberate sabotage of American military capabilities for personal and political gain. The scope and sophistication of the discriminatory network, combined with its devastating impact on victims and national security, had been thoroughly documented through witness testimony, physical evidence, and expert analysis that left little room for reasonable doubt about defendants' guilt. The jury deliberations stretched into their third day as 12 citizens grappled with the overwhelming evidence of systematic discrimination and conspiracy that had undermined American military effectiveness for over a decade. Judge Hernandez had provided comprehensive instructions covering federal conspiracy laws, civil rights violations, and the complex intersection of military justice with civilian criminal proceedings. The weight of their decision extended far beyond individual defendants to encompass fundamental questions about accountability, justice, and the future of American military culture. Outside the courthouse, media coverage intensified as legal analysts debated the potential sentences facing convicted defendants and the broader implications for military reform initiatives. Constitutional law professor Dr. Amanda Stevens appeared on national television explaining how guilty verdicts would establish unprecedented legal precedents for prosecuting systematic discrimination within federal institutions while setting new standards for accountability among military leadership. The defense teams, led by former military attorneys with decades of experience, had attempted to present alternative narratives about patriotic intentions and institutional loyalty. However, their closing arguments failed to overcome the prosecution's comprehensive presentation of evidence showing calculated criminal conspiracy motivated by financial gain and discriminatory hatred rather than legitimate military concerns. Defense attorney Richardson's final plea for leniency, based on his client's military service records, was undermined by the prosecution's demonstration that those same records had been used to facilitate and conceal criminal activities. International observers monitored the proceedings closely as allied nations sought assurance that American military leadership could be trusted to make decisions based on professional merit rather than discriminatory biases. NATO Secretary General Lars Anderson issued public statements expressing confidence in American military reform efforts, while emphasizing that systematic discrimination represented threats to alliance effectiveness and shared security objectives. The trial's outcome would influence international perceptions of American military reliability and commitment to democratic values. When the jury foreman announced that verdicts had been reached on all counts, the courthouse erupted in controlled chaos as media representatives, legal observers, and victim advocates crowded into the courtroom for the historic moment. Judge Hernandez maintained strict courtroom decorum while acknowledging the significance of proceedings that would determine whether systematic discrimination within American military institutions would face meaningful legal consequences. The reading of guilty verdicts on all major charges against all 37 defendants marked a watershed moment in American military justice history. Colonel Hartwell's conviction on conspiracy, civil rights violations, mail fraud, and obstruction of justice charges carried a potential sentence of 45 years in federal prison, while his co-conspirators faced similar penalties based on their roles in the discriminatory network. The unanimous guilty verdicts demonstrated that American juries would not tolerate systematic discrimination regardless of defendants' military rank or claimed patriotic motivations. Victim advocates celebrated the verdicts as vindication for hundreds of military personnel whose careers had been destroyed by criminal conspiracy, while legal experts emphasized the precedential value of successful prosecutions for systematic institutional discrimination. The verdicts established that military rank provided no immunity for federal prosecution for civil rights violations and demonstrated that systematic discrimination would face serious legal consequences regardless of attempts to conceal criminal activities through official authority. The sentencing phase began immediately following conviction, as federal guidelines required comprehensive assessment of defendants' criminal activities, victim impact, and potential for rehabilitation. Prosecutor Chen presented detailed calculations showing that network operations had cost targeted officers over $20 million in lost wages, benefits, and career advancement opportunities, while undermining military effectiveness through systematic elimination of talented personnel based on racial characteristics rather than professional merit. Colonel Hartwell's sentencing hearing revealed the full scope of his criminal leadership within the discriminatory network. Evidence presented during sentencing showed that Hartwell had personally coordinated attacks against 43 minority officers across multiple installations while receiving over $200,000 in payments from private contractors seeking to maintain competitive advantages through systematic discrimination. His role as a senior military officer who had sworn to defend constitutional principles made his betrayal particularly egregious in Judge Hernandez's assessment. Victim impact statements during sentencing provided powerful testimony about lives destroyed by systematic discrimination and the broader damage caused to military institutions and American society. Trevor Washington's family described years of financial hardship, psychological trauma, and loss of faith in military justice systems that had failed to protect them from criminal persecution. His daughter Emma, now attending civilian college instead of military academy, spoke about abandoning her childhood dreams of military service after witnessing her father's destruction. The corporate executives from private military contractors faced separate sentencing proceedings that revealed the profit motives underlying systematic discrimination. CEO Marcus Thompson received a 30-year sentence after prosecutors demonstrated that his company had generated millions in revenue by eliminating minority military personnel who might later compete for lucrative consulting contracts. The intersection of discrimination and financial exploitation added additional penalties under federal racketeering statutes designed to combat organized criminal enterprises. Congressional corruption resulting from the discriminatory network faced political consequences beyond criminal sentencing, as Congressman Bradley Mitchell's conviction triggered ethics investigations and potential expulsion proceedings. Mitchell's 25-year sentence for bribery and conspiracy demonstrated that elected officials who facilitated systematic discrimination would face serious criminal consequences, while his political career ended in disgrace and public condemnation from former colleagues who distanced themselves from his criminal activities. The broader military reform initiatives accelerated following the successful prosecutions as Pentagon leadership implemented comprehensive changes designed to prevent future discriminatory networks from operating within American armed forces. Defense Secretary Kim announced the establishment of independent oversight offices, mandatory bias training for all command personnel, and anonymous reporting systems that would allow discrimination victims to seek justice without fear of retaliation from superior officers. International security implications of the discriminatory network continued unfolding as intelligence agencies revealed that foreign adversaries had successfully exploited American military weaknesses created by systematic elimination of talented minority personnel whose expertise had been crucial for mission success. Classified briefings to congressional oversight committees showed that certain military operations had failed or performed below expectations due to personnel shortages created by discriminating targeting of qualified officers whose expertise had been crucial for mission success. The financial restitution process began with federal courts ordering defendants to pay over $50 million in damages to discrimination victims, while class action lawsuits against private contractors and government agencies promised additional compensation for systematic violations of civil rights and employment law. Legal experts predicted that total restitution costs would exceed $200 million when all victim claims were processed and adjudicated through federal court systems.
Military culture transformation initiatives expanded beyond legal requirements as service branches implemented comprehensive reforms designed to rebuild trust among minority personnel and demonstrate institutional commitment to merit-based advancement opportunities. The establishment of diversity oversight committees, independent review boards, and transparent promotion processes represented fundamental changes to military structures that had enabled systematic discrimination to flourish for over a decade. Academic institutions began incorporating case studies of the discriminatory network into military leadership curricula, using the conspiracy as an example of how institutional biases could undermine organizational effectiveness and compromise national security objectives. Military academies implemented mandatory coursework covering civil rights law, ethical leadership, and the professional obligations of officers to protect subordinates from discrimination and harassment. The psychological recovery process for discrimination victims required extensive counseling and support services as many officers struggled with trauma, depression, and loss of faith in military institutions they had served with distinction. Rodriguez's ongoing research into discrimination trauma became foundational for developing treatment protocols and support systems designed to help victims rebuild their careers and personal lives after systematic persecution. Public opinion polling showed overwhelming support for the prosecutions and military reforms, with Americans across political affiliations expressing approval for holding military leaders accountable for systematic discrimination. The successful prosecutions demonstrated that American justice systems could address institutional discrimination when provided with sufficient evidence and political will to pursue criminal charges, regardless of defendants' rank or political connections. As the immediate legal proceedings concluded with defendants beginning their federal prison sentences, the long-term implications of the discriminatory network continued reverberating through American military and political institutions. The case had established new legal precedents, triggered comprehensive institutional reforms, and demonstrated that systematic discrimination would face serious consequences regardless of attempts to conceal criminal activities through official authority or claims of patriotic motivation. 3 years after Colonel Hartwell's arrest transformed a single act of injustice into the largest military corruption investigation in American history, the reverberations continue reshaping military culture, federal law enforcement priorities, and international perceptions of American institutional integrity. The Washington Military Justice Reform Act, signed into law by President Harris following unanimous congressional approval, established permanent oversight mechanisms designed to prevent future discriminatory networks from operating within federal institutions, while providing enhanced protection for whistleblowers who expose systematic violations of civil rights. Trevor Washington stands today as Lieutenant Colonel Washington, having been promoted twice in recognition of his exceptional service and the courage he demonstrated in challenging institutional discrimination despite overwhelming personal and professional risks. His current assignment as Director of Military Ethics Training at the Pentagon represents both personal vindication and institutional acknowledgement that his case catalyzed fundamental changes in how American armed forces address discrimination, accountability, and ethical leadership among command personnel. The irony is not lost on military observers that the officer once unjustly demoted now oversees training programs designed to prevent future discriminatory networks from forming within American military institutions. Washington's new role encompasses responsibilities that extend far beyond traditional military training protocols. He has developed comprehensive curricula covering implicit bias recognition, ethical decision-making under pressure, and the legal obligations of command personnel to protect subordinates from discrimination and harassment. His training programs, now mandatory for all officers seeking promotion to command positions, have been implemented across every branch of the military and adapted for use by allied nations seeking to address their own institutional bias challenges. The transformation of Washington's career trajectory from near destruction to institutional leadership demonstrates the profound changes that have occurred within military culture following the Patriot Shield investigation. His office in the Pentagon, once occupied by officials who might have enabled discriminatory networks, now serves as headquarters for efforts to eliminate systematic bias from military institutions. The symbolic significance of his position resonates throughout the military community as proof that merit-based advancement can triumph over discriminatory persecution when supported by effective oversight and accountability mechanisms. Washington's family has recovered from the trauma inflicted by systematic persecution, though the experience permanently altered their relationship with military institutions and American society. His daughter Emma, now a senior at Harvard Law School specializing in civil rights law, credits her father's ordeal with inspiring her commitment to ensuring that future generations of military families receive protection from institutional discrimination. Her undergraduate thesis on systematic bias in federal institutions has been cited in congressional hearings and academic research examining organizational reform strategies, while her law review articles on military justice reform have influenced policy discussions at the highest levels of government. Emma's younger brother Marcus, named after the grandfather who had inspired Washington's military service, chose a different path by pursuing engineering at MIT with plans to develop technological solutions for detecting and preventing institutional bias. His senior project focuses on artificial intelligence systems capable of identifying discriminatory patterns in personnel decisions, promotion timelines, and resource allocation processes. The intersection of technology and civil rights represented by Marcus's work demonstrates how the next generation of leaders plans to address institutional discrimination through innovative approaches that previous generations could not have imagined. Sarah Washington, who had endured years of uncertainty and financial hardship during her husband's ordeal, has become a prominent advocate for military families affected by institutional discrimination. Her testimony before congressional committees has influenced legislation providing support services for discrimination victims, while her work with nonprofit organizations has helped hundreds of military families navigate the complex legal and psychological challenges created by systematic persecution. The Washington family's transformation from victims to advocates illustrates the resilience and determination that can emerge from confronting institutional injustice. The Patriot Shield case established legal precedents that fundamentally transformed federal approaches to prosecuting institutional discrimination across government agencies, law enforcement organizations, and military branches. Federal prosecutors now maintain specialized units focused exclusively on systematic civil rights violations, while new legal standards require comprehensive investigation of discriminatory patterns rather than treating individual incidents as isolated misconduct. The precedential value of successful conspiracy prosecutions has enabled federal authorities to dismantle discriminatory networks in civilian law enforcement agencies, immigration services, and educational institutions. Assistant United States Attorney Michael Chen, who led the prosecution of Patriot Shield defendants, has been promoted to oversee the newly created Civil Rights Conspiracy Division within the Department of Justice. This specialized unit, established with congressional funding specifically allocated for investigating institutional discrimination, has already opened investigations into suspected discriminatory networks within federal immigration enforcement, state corrections systems, and municipal police departments. Chen's expertise in prosecuting complex conspiracy cases has become the standard for federal approaches to systematic civil rights violations. The legal framework developed during Patriot Shield prosecutions has been adopted by international criminal courts and human rights tribunals addressing institutional discrimination in other nations. The UN Special Rapporteur on Racism has cited the successful American prosecutions as a model for holding government officials accountable for systematic discrimination, while the International Criminal Court has incorporated Patriot Shield precedents into its framework for prosecuting crimes against humanity involving systematic persecution based on racial characteristics. Colonel Hartwell completed his third year of federal imprisonment at a maximum security facility in Colorado, where he serves as a cautionary example of how military rank provides no immunity from criminal prosecution for civil rights violations. Prison interviews conducted by academic researchers studying institutional discrimination reveal that Hartwell continued expressing resentment about his prosecution while failing to acknowledge the criminal nature of his actions or the devastating impact on his victims. His anticipated release date in 2047 ensures that he will spend the remainder of his productive years in federal custody, serving as a permanent reminder that systematic discrimination carries serious criminal consequences.
The conditions of Hartwell's imprisonment have been deliberately structured to reinforce the gravity of his crimes and their impact on national security. He serves his sentence alongside other federal prisoners convicted of treason, espionage, and terrorism-related offenses, reflecting judicial recognition that systematic discrimination within military institutions represents betrayal of constitutional principles and American democratic values. His fellow inmates include former CIA officers convicted of selling secrets to foreign governments and military contractors who had compromised national security for financial gain, emphasizing that his crimes are viewed as equivalent to other forms of institutional betrayal. Psychological evaluations conducted during Hartwell's imprisonment reveal personality traits and belief systems that enabled his participation in discriminatory networks. Clinical assessments indicate narcissistic personality characteristics, resistance to organizational change, and adherence to hierarchical power structures that prioritized personal advancement over institutional effectiveness or ethical obligations. These psychological profiles have informed research into preventing future discriminatory networks by identifying warning signs and developing intervention strategies for addressing bias-motivated misconduct before it escalates to criminal conspiracy. The private military contracting industry underwent comprehensive transformation following revelations about systematic discrimination, funding, and coordination with criminal networks. New federal regulations require diversity compliance auditing, transparent hiring practices, and independent oversight of contractor relationships with military personnel. Companies including Apex Defense Solutions and Strategic Military Consulting were dissolved following criminal convictions, while their assets were liquidated to provide additional restitution for discrimination victims and fund military diversity initiatives. The transformation of private military contracting extends beyond regulatory compliance to encompass fundamental changes in corporate culture and business practices. Major defense contractors now employ chief diversity officers with executive authority to investigate discrimination complaints, while procurement processes require demonstrated commitment to equal employment opportunities and bias prevention training. The financial penalties imposed on companies involved in discriminatory networks have created powerful economic incentives for maintaining inclusive workplace cultures and preventing future bias-motivated misconduct. International defense contractors seeking to do business with American military forces must now demonstrate compliance with diversity standards and submit to independent auditing of their personnel practices. This requirement has influenced hiring and promotion practices throughout the global defense industry, as companies recognize that discriminatory behavior can result in exclusion from lucrative government contracts. The extraterritorial impact of American diversity requirements has contributed to improved workplace equality in allied nations and partner countries whose defense industries depend on American military contracts. Dr. Elena Rodriguez has become the leading academic authority on institutional discrimination within military organizations, publishing groundbreaking research that has influenced reform efforts across multiple nations and international military alliances. Her longitudinal studies of discrimination recovery among Patriot Shield victims have established new therapeutic protocols while providing comprehensive data about the long-term psychological and professional consequences of systematic persecution. Her work now guides policy development at the United Nations, NATO, and academic institutions worldwide. Rodriguez's research has revealed that systematic discrimination creates trauma patterns similar to those observed in victims of political persecution and ethnic cleansing, requiring specialized treatment approaches that address both individual psychological damage and broader institutional betrayal. Her therapeutic protocols have been adopted by veterans' healthcare systems, civilian counseling services, and international human rights organizations working with victims of institutional discrimination. The intersection of clinical psychology and civil rights advocacy, represented by Rodriguez's work, has created new fields of study and professional practice. The establishment of the Rodriguez Institute for Institutional Justice at Georgetown University provides permanent research infrastructure for studying discrimination patterns, developing prevention strategies, and training future leaders in bias recognition and intervention techniques. The Institute's fellowship programs attract scholars, practitioners, and policymakers from around the world who seek to understand and address systematic discrimination within their own institutional contexts. The international reach of Rodriguez's research demonstrates how American experiences with institutional discrimination have informed global efforts to promote equality and justice. The international security implications of American military discrimination have continued unfolding as intelligence agencies declassify assessments showing that foreign adversaries had successfully exploited internal divisions created by systematic elimination of talented minority personnel. Congressional intelligence briefings revealed that certain strategic failures during the period of network operations resulted directly from personnel shortages created by discriminatory targeting of qualified officers whose expertise proved irreplaceable during critical missions. These revelations have influenced international military cooperation agreements and alliance partnership structures.
Declassified intelligence reports have revealed that Chinese, Russian, and Iranian intelligence services had specifically monitored American military discrimination patterns and adjusted their strategic planning based on assessments that systematic bias was weakening American military capabilities. Foreign intelligence agencies had identified the elimination of talented minority officers as a vulnerability that could be exploited during international crises, while psychological warfare campaigns had attempted to amplify internal divisions created by discriminatory networks. The intersection of discrimination and national security has demonstrated that civil rights violations represent not only moral failures, but strategic vulnerabilities that could be exploited by adversarial nations. NATO alliance structures have been strengthened through implementation of diversity standards and discrimination prevention protocols based on lessons learned from the Patriot Shield investigation. Allied nations have adopted similar oversight mechanisms, anonymous reporting systems, and accountability measures designed to prevent discriminatory networks from undermining military effectiveness. The shared commitment to merit-based advancement and inclusive leadership has enhanced alliance cohesion while demonstrating that diversity represents a strategic advantage rather than a political liability. Military recruitment and retention statistics demonstrate measurable improvement in minority participation following comprehensive reforms and successful prosecutions of discriminatory networks. The establishment of independent oversight offices, transparent promotion processes, and anonymous reporting systems has restored confidence among minority communities that military service provides legitimate pathways for advancement based on merit rather than racial characteristics. Recruitment levels among African American, Hispanic, and Asian American populations have reached historic highs, while retention rates indicate sustained improvement in institutional culture. The recruitment improvements extend beyond simple numerical increases to encompass qualitative enhancements in the caliber and motivation of minority personnel seeking military careers. Top-performing minority students who previously avoided military service due to concerns about discriminatory treatment now view the armed forces as attractive career options, offering genuine opportunities for advancement and leadership development. This shift in perception has enabled military recruiters to attract exceptional talent that had previously been lost to civilian careers or other government agencies. Retention data reveals that minority military personnel now report higher levels of job satisfaction, career optimism, and institutional trust compared to surveys conducted before the Patriot Shield investigation. Exit interviews with departing personnel indicate that discrimination concerns, which had previously been the primary reason for minority officers leaving military service, have been replaced by normal career considerations such as family obligations, educational opportunities, and civilian job prospects.
This transformation in retention patterns demonstrates that institutional reforms have successfully addressed the systematic bias that had driven talented personnel away from military careers. Congressional oversight mechanisms established following the Patriot Shield investigation have identified and prevented several attempts to establish new discriminatory networks within federal agencies. The Permanent Subcommittee on Institutional Discrimination maintains ongoing monitoring of federal personnel practices while conducting regular audits of promotion patterns, disciplinary actions, and resource allocation decisions that might indicate systematic bias. These oversight efforts have prevented discriminatory networks from reforming while ensuring accountability for federal officials responsible for personnel management.
The Congressional Oversight Framework includes quarterly reporting requirements for all federal agencies regarding diversity metrics, discrimination complaints, and personnel decision-making processes. Agency leaders must personally certify that their institutions maintain bias-free environments while providing detailed explanations for any statistical disparities in promotion rates, disciplinary actions, or resource allocation that might suggest discriminatory patterns. The personal accountability requirements have created powerful incentives for agency leadership to prioritize diversity and prevent discriminatory practices. Whistleblower protection mechanisms have been strengthened through legislation providing financial incentives, career security, and legal representation for federal employees who report systematic discrimination. The success of these protections is demonstrated by increased reporting of potential bias incidents and early intervention in situations that might otherwise escalate to criminal conspiracy levels. The combination of enhanced protection and accountability has created an environment where discriminatory behavior is quickly identified and addressed before it can develop into systematic networks. The financial restitution process has distributed over $300 million to discrimination victims through federal court orders, class action settlements, and congressional appropriations designed to compensate for systematic violations of civil rights and employment law. These payments have enabled many victims to rebuild their careers, pursue advanced education, and recover from financial devastation caused by criminal persecution. The restitution process has also funded comprehensive support services for discrimination victims, including counseling, legal assistance, and career rehabilitation programs. Individual restitution awards have varied based on the scope of discrimination experienced, career damage sustained, and long-term financial impact of systematic persecution. Major Nicole Jackson received the largest individual settlement of $8 million in recognition of the comprehensive destruction of her military career and subsequent psychological trauma that required extensive treatment and rehabilitation. Her settlement has enabled her to pursue a doctoral degree in international relations while supporting her family and contributing to discrimination prevention advocacy efforts. The restitution process has established precedents for compensating discrimination victims that extend beyond financial payments to include career rehabilitation services, educational opportunities, and professional development support. Many victims have used their settlements to start businesses, pursue advanced degrees, or transition into new careers that utilize their military training and experience. The comprehensive approach to victim compensation demonstrates institutional commitment to addressing the full scope of damage caused by systematic discrimination. Academic institutions worldwide have incorporated the Patriot Shield case into curricula covering organizational leadership, institutional reform, and civil rights enforcement. Military academies, law schools, and public administration programs use the conspiracy as a case study demonstrating how systematic discrimination undermines organizational effectiveness while creating vulnerabilities that can be exploited by external adversaries. These educational initiatives have influenced a generation of future leaders who understand the professional and ethical obligation to prevent institutional discrimination. Professional military education has been fundamentally transformed through incorporation of Patriot Shield lessons into officer training programs, leadership development courses, and ethics instruction. Future military leaders now receive comprehensive training in bias recognition, discrimination prevention, and the legal consequences of systematic civil rights violations.
This educational transformation ensures that future generations of military leaders understand their professional and legal obligations to maintain inclusive institutions that advance personnel based on merit rather than racial characteristics. The psychological recovery process for discrimination victims has yielded important insights about trauma treatment and institutional accountability that extend far beyond military applications. Research conducted with Patriot Shield survivors has informed therapeutic approaches for victims of workplace discrimination, institutional harassment, and systematic persecution across various organizational contexts. The establishment of specialized treatment centers has provided models for addressing discrimination trauma that have been adopted by civilian healthcare systems and international human rights organizations. Treatment protocols developed for Patriot Shield victims have revealed that institutional discrimination creates complex trauma patterns requiring specialized therapeutic approaches that address both individual psychological damage and broader betrayal by trusted institutions. The therapeutic framework developed by Dr. Rodriguez and her colleagues has been adapted for treating victims of police misconduct, educational discrimination, healthcare bias, and employment discrimination across various civilian contexts. The clinical insights gained from military discrimination cases have contributed to broader understanding of institutional trauma and recovery processes. Long-term follow-up studies with discrimination victims have documented both the lasting psychological impact of systematic persecution and the resilience factors that enable recovery and post-traumatic growth. Many victims have reported that their experiences, while traumatic, ultimately strengthened their commitment to justice and equality while developing leadership capabilities that they now use to prevent discrimination in their current careers. The transformation of victims into advocates demonstrates the potential for positive outcomes when discrimination survivors receive appropriate support and opportunities for meaningful contribution to reform efforts. Public awareness of institutional discrimination has increased dramatically following comprehensive media coverage of the Patriot Shield investigation, trials, and ongoing reform efforts. Opinion polling consistently shows overwhelming public support for aggressive prosecution of systematic discrimination while endorsing comprehensive institutional reforms designed to prevent future violations. This sustained public attention has created political pressure for continued vigilance and accountability that makes regression to previous discriminatory practices politically untenable. Media coverage has evolved from initial shock about the scope of military discrimination to sustained examination of institutional bias across various government agencies and civilian organizations. Investigative journalism inspired by the Patriot Shield case has uncovered discriminatory patterns in civilian law enforcement, educational institutions, healthcare systems, and corporate environments. The broader media attention has contributed to national conversations about institutional bias and the importance of accountability mechanisms in preventing systematic discrimination. Social media campaigns and grassroots advocacy movements have emerged from Patriot Shield case awareness, creating ongoing pressure for institutional accountability and reform implementation. Veterans organizations, civil rights groups, and student movements have maintained focus on discrimination prevention while supporting victims and advocating for stronger oversight mechanisms. The sustained public engagement demonstrates that Patriot Shield has become a catalyst for broader social movements promoting equality and institutional justice. The legacy of Trevor Washington's courage in challenging institutional injustice extends far beyond his personal vindication to encompass fundamental transformation of American military culture and federal approaches to civil rights enforcement. His decision to pursue justice despite overwhelming personal and professional risks demonstrated that individual conscience and moral courage remain powerful forces for institutional change when supported by legal protections and investigative resources. The case established that systematic discrimination, regardless of its sophistication or institutional protection, cannot withstand determined pursuit of justice by individuals willing to sacrifice personal comfort for principles of equality and constitutional rights.
Washington's example has inspired similar courage among federal employees, military personnel, and civilian workers who face discriminatory treatment in their own institutional contexts. Reports of discrimination complaints have increased significantly across federal agencies as employees gain confidence that their concerns will be taken seriously and that retaliation will face serious consequences. The demonstration effect of successful discrimination prosecution has empowered victims to seek justice while discouraging potential perpetrators from engaging in discriminatory behavior.
The institutional changes sparked by Washington's case have created permanent improvements in military culture that will protect future generations of service members from systematic discrimination. The combination of legal accountability, oversight mechanisms, cultural transformation, and educational reform has established multiple layers of protection against discriminatory networks while promoting genuine merit-based advancement opportunities. These systemic improvements ensure that Washington's legacy will continue protecting military personnel long after his own career concludes. As military and civilian institutions continue implementing reforms inspired by the Patriot Shield investigation, the fundamental lesson remains clear. Institutional discrimination represents not only moral failure, but practical vulnerability that undermines organizational effectiveness while creating opportunities for external exploitation. The successful prosecution of systematic discrimination within American military institutions has demonstrated that comprehensive accountability, transparent oversight, and individual courage can overcome even the most sophisticated attempts to maintain discriminatory power structures through criminal conspiracy and institutional abuse. The transformation sparked by one major's refusal to accept unjust treatment has created lasting change that will protect future generations of military personnel while strengthening American military effectiveness through genuine merit-based advancement and inclusive leadership development. Trevor Washington's legacy ensures that systematic discrimination will face serious consequences while providing inspiration for individuals who confront institutional injustice in pursuit of equal treatment and constitutional rights. The case demonstrates that individual courage, when supported by institutional accountability and legal protection, can transform entire organizations and create lasting progress toward equality and justice. Up next, you got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.